Welcome to Growing in Uncertainty. My name is Tess Miller, and through my seminar and coaching business, Wings Unfolded, I help people who love what they're doing but they're not sure where it's going, which is basically where I have spent much of my career, which is why I make these videos. I feel like I'm growing in uncertainty or through my uncertainty by making these videos. And I hope that if you're feeling uncertain or stuck in any place of your life, you can grow in uncertainty with me. So thank you so much for being here today. I was going for a walk the other day, and all of a sudden the should factory started happening. I started realizing that I was making all these should statements to myself, like I should be writing more, I should clean my house, I should weed my yard, I should be doing more of this or less of that. And, years ago, I went to a therapist who also noticed that I had a tendency to say a lot of should things. And he recommended that I completely eliminate the word should from my vocabulary. And at first, it felt like I was trying to walk in the rain without an umbrella and not get wet. It was nearly impossible, in other words. And I realized that I had to start with just simply being aware of when I would start saying should to myself, or how many times I would say should to myself. And eventually I got to the point where I was aware of when I was about to say should to myself. But still, sometimes, especially if I'm feeling stressed out or tired, the should statements just kind of happen automatically. And that's where I was the other day on my walk. But fortunately, I've practiced enough that I can get into observer mode pretty quickly when I need to. And this means that rather than suppressing whatever my thoughts are that are coming up for me, I just let them come and I just observe them. I just watch them as they come. And after opening the door to them, I can start asking myself some questions about those thoughts. For example, I started asking myself the other day, who says that you should do all of these things? And my answer was, I do. And then I asked, what would happen if they don't all get done? And I said, I would be a failure. And then I asked, how true is that? Or no, actually first I asked, a failure at what? And I said, life, kind of big. But then, I asked myself, how true is it that you're going to fail in life if you don't get all of your things done? And my response was, it depends. Who's asking? And then I asked, oh, what do you mean by that? And I thought, well, what if I look like a failure to other people if I don't get all those things done? So that was kind of an interesting revelation, that all of my should statements were coming from a place of how I might end up looking to other people if I don't get them all done. So suddenly the phrase, stop seeing yourself through the eyes of others, popped into my head. And I know I've heard that phrase before. I don't know where or when, but for whatever reason, my memory served that up for me in that moment. And it really made me pause. Like, wow, am I really only seeing myself through the eyes of others? And if so, what would it be like to just see myself through my own eyes? What would that experience be like? So it dawned on me in that moment that I was falling back into a personal pattern that I've had for a very, very long time, which is the pattern of judging myself in the way that I think other people might be judging me. Whether it's true or not, it's easy to fall into those patterns. For me anyway, it's very easy to fall into that pattern of thinking that other people are judging me in some way. And that pattern has everything in the world to do with my ego. And ironically, I just talked about patterns a couple videos ago, or a few videos ago. So if you want to check that one out, it's called Breaking Harmful Habits and Painful Patterns. And that might help you get to the point where you can start to see some of the patterns that might be holding you back in your life. So before I get talking more about my personal pattern, I wanted to look a little more at what ego really is. And depending on where you look, ego can be described as an essential aspect of being human, or something that needs to be completely removed from our lives. It just kind of depends. A lot of articles that I've sifted through, or talks that I've been to, people, really think of the word ego as meaning, someone who boasts a lot about themselves and they lack empathy. They're really only concerned with themselves. And as a result, there's just a lot of information about how to remove it completely or dissolve the ego. But ego, when you really look at the definition, is actually a neutral term. So an ego, according to the dictionary, is a person's a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance. It's how we distinguish ourselves from others. It's that part of us that reacts to the outside world. Synonyms to ego are pride, pridefulness, self-esteem, self-regard, self-respect. And admittedly, when I was looking at this definition, there was one word that really triggered me, and that was the word pride. And I'll get to that word in just a second. So anyway, as you can see, ego is actually a neutral term. There is nothing good or bad about it. It's just how we distinguish ourselves from other people in our lives. It's how we create our individuality in this existence. So, despite the fact that it is a neutral term, people are still trying to get rid of our ego completely. Especially in religious contexts, there's a lot of language around dissolving the ego or rising above the ego. And I'd like to propose that there is an actual need for ego, and that there's a difference between having an ego and being egotistical. So let's look at what egotistical means. If one is egotistical, they tend to be excessively conceited or absorbed in themselves. They're very self-centered. They might have an inflated view of their self-importance. It's when someone thinks they're better than everyone else. And this would be an unhealthy use of ego. So then I wanted to know, what's the opposite of egotistical? And I looked at the word selfless. Selfless is when one is concerned more with the needs or wishes of others, or having no concern for oneself. And this is where my own pattern comes into play. At some point in my life, I developed a core belief that being selfless was the best way to be in the world. If I was selfless, then my relationships would always enjoy peace and harmony, and I would be regarded as good by society. Well, of course, I've had the experience in my life of, despite how selfless I've been, my relationships still had conflict. So, how do I resolve that one, right? So anyway, I realized in reflecting on that idea of, how I've really tried to be as selfless as possible in my life, I realized, it's actually something I'm proud of in my life. Remember when I said the word pride was actually a trigger word for me? So pride for me, that word, I've tended to, for myself, define it as the opposite of being selfless. It's the opposite of what my pattern has always tried to be. So isn't it ironic that the act of trying to get away from my own ego there's actually pride about doing that, pride in not having an ego. But isn't pride part of the definition of ego? You see where I'm getting at? So, how true is it that if I am egoless, that's something I should be proud of? So it was because of my pride at being egoless that I realized that ego was actually not as easy to pin down as good or bad. And up until very recently, I did tend to view ego as a bad thing. But I also saw and have seen in my life how being selfless can end up making me feel really angry and resentful in my life. When I relinquish all of my needs and wants in a relationship and other people don't tend to give up what they need and want, my resentment tends to build up in that situation. I still find myself sometimes thinking things like, I never get what I want, which sounds very Eeyore-ish if you're a fan of Winnie the Pooh. And it's definitely something I've been working hard to heal in my life. And my healing work has included redefining for myself that ego is neither a good or a bad thing. Ego is actually a tool that we can use to help navigate our way in the world. Excuse me. So, according to psychology, there are 3 parts of our identity, and you've probably all heard this at some point, but this is a way that I learned to look at these 3 parts of our identity in a really comprehensive way. So I hope this helps you. The 3 parts of our identity are the ego, the id, and the superego. The id is it's comprised of our innate wants and needs and desires. It's just whatever, I really want that cookie. I really want to be a musician. I really want to do this as my career. It's, without thought, you just have that innate need or want. The superego is the programming that you've received in your life. It's all the beliefs, the values, the societal beliefs and values that have been passed on to you, what your family as a collective has believed and valued, and it's all of your should statements. So whenever you find yourself saying, I should fill in the blank, that's your superego talking. So that can be a good rule of thumb to use. But when the id, when what you want is at odds with the superego, your programming, it's the ego's job to decide what to do in that moment. The ego in that moment is a tool that helps you take action. So let's say someone wants to be a music major for their career, and that desire is coming from their id. But their parents program them to believe that they'll end up being poor and penniless if they become a musician. That would be coming from their superego. So they decide to become an accountant instead. Now, the ego in this case is siding with the superego, with the programming. The id is not going to be too happy about that, especially if the person, making this decision hasn't done anything to reconcile their own wants in that decision. And so they'll likely end up with a struggle. And that's how a lot of people can come to a place in their lives where they realize, I didn't want to be an accountant, I wanted to be a musician. And they might have some regret about the choices that they made in their life, or, their career might actually come to a standstill. They might get stuck in mid-career. So now I'm going to apply my own pattern to this idea of the id, ego, and superego. part of my own programming, my superego, is that I believe that I will have harmonious relationships if I put other people's needs ahead of my own. Where did I get this programming? Honestly, I have no idea. I really don't know. That's the thing with programming. We may never know or really understand where it came from, but it's there. My id, on the other hand, really wants to feel taken care of. My id wants to feel like it has value and worth. My needs and wants have value and worth. But my superego wants to make sure that I am acting in accordance with my programmed beliefs. And again, my superego is programmed to believe that if I put myself first, I will be seen by others as being selfish and people won't like me. I won't have harmonious relationships. So in that moment, my ego has to choose between my id and my superego. And what can happen when my ego is trying to make that choice is that I can feel anxious. My mind can get stuck in thought loops. Heavy emotions can come up for me, and I start creating stories that kind of validate whatever I'm thinking or feeling, but may not necessarily be rooted in reality. And ultimately, the path to getting unstuck when your ego is stuck in between the id and superego is to work on developing a healthy ego. So what's a healthy ego? If your ego is healthy, then that means that you have an ability to regulate painful emotions that might be rooted in anger or fear. It might also mean that you can feel secure in yourself and your relationships with other people. A healthy ego also helps you find resilience when life gets really hard. And it helps give you some kind of capacity for knowing what brings meaning to your life and to your relationships. So when the ego is healthy, we can start to make conscious choices that align with who we are authentically. And who we are is usually somewhere between the id and the superego. The healthy ego helps us find that balance. We need the ego, in other words. But if our ego is dysfunctional, it will be like trying to drive a car with one wheel missing. So, how do we develop a healthy ego? First of all, we cultivate self-awareness, and we also develop self-love, and we work on forgiving ourselves. Basically, you watch all of the videos I've been making for the last year, and all of them have to do with developing a healthy sense of your ego. You can also get my book, the book of Stuck. And if you really want to get your ego healthy, think about contacting me and working with me. I'd love to help you develop the healthiest ego you possibly can have as you navigate your own life. So, what happened the other day when my ego was trapped between my id and my superego? I used my ego to help me. Remember that phrase that popped into my head? Stop seeing yourself through the eyes of others. That was what my ego told me. That came directly from my ego. And it reminded me that I needed to be checking in with my id for some guidance. And what did my id need in that moment? Well, I definitely needed to go for a walk to stop any of the thought loops, any of the should statements that were coming from my superego. I needed a break from worrying about how I was being perceived by anyone in my life. And I needed to check in with the thoughts and feelings that were rooted in old beliefs rather than my consciously chosen beliefs. And because I've worked to question the status quo of my conditioned beliefs, I can more easily make those conscious choices and move toward what's in my best interest, what's most authentic to me, before resorting to my old ways of being. My ego, after working for years to heal and bolster its health, can now be used as a healthy navigational tool. And that's all the ego really is. It's just a tool. So like any tool, it can be used for positive and it can be used for negative things. And who gets to decide what's positive and negative? Well, we all do for ourselves. I hope this message resonates with you. Thank you so much for joining me whenever and wherever you join me. I'm always so grateful for your presence and to hear any feedback that you want to share. And it would mean so much to me if you would like or share or subscribe in any way to my content. That helps other people find me as well. So that would, really, really help me out a lot and mean a lot if you could do that. You can stay tuned to any of my updates on Facebook or LinkedIn under my business name, Wings Unfolded. You can find me under my name, Tess Miller, on Instagram and on YouTube, where you can find all my other videos posted in Growing in Uncertainty. And if there's something you'd like help with in regards to being stuck or uncertain or just in a life transition, please feel free to send me a private message. I'd love to connect with you. And remember that it's okay to be stuck, but you don't have to stay there. Have an amazing week and take care.